Dakle, kao što vjerovatno dobro znate, prvi gost ove današnje večeri je Boris Kagarlitsky, koji je ruski marksistički teoretičar i sociolog, politički disident u Sovjetskom savezu pa i u postsovjetskoj Rusiji. Zbog svog aktivizma 2 puta je bio uhapšen, 1972. i 1993. godine. Koordinator je projekta Globalna kriza pri Transnacionalnom institutu i direktor Instituta za globalizaciju i društvene pokrete u Moskvi. Od 1994. do 2002. godine bio je viši istraživač saradnik na Institutu za uporedne političke nauke Ruske akademije nauka. I dozvolit ću sebi taj luksus da ovdje stanem. Mislim da će tema ovog predavanja biti odnos između ekonomije i politike, ali u kontekstu krize. Naime, ako se postavlja svom silinom to pitanje, taj problem ispreplitanosti između ekonomije i politike, onda je to sasvim sigurno stanje krize. Kriza s jedne strane otvara mnogobrojne mogućnosti, ona je uvijek i rekonfiguracija postojećih mogućnosti, međutim istovremeno kriza je i generator takvih afekata kao što je strah. Kriza veoma često i zaustavlja neke započete procese. To jeste ono što se kolokvijalno zove izazov krize. Dakle, pokušavamo da dajemo odgovor zašto, reklo bi se, ta tvrdoglava upornost nekih starih rešenja, zašto tvrdoglavo postojanje, perzistentnost, ako mogu da kažem, neoliberalizma. Boris, please, take the floor and...
Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation. Of course, I'm very happy to be in Belgrade. I'm here for the first time, and hopefully not for the last time. And I'm also very happy to have the opportunity to speak to the people who somehow represent the new left emerging in the post-Yugoslav societies. Because we also have some Bosnian comrades here. And this is, of course, a very nice and positive impression, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the so-called communist system in Eastern Europe, there was, in a certain sense, a catastrophic moral situation on the left, because it kind of disappeared. And the strange thing was that in Russia we kept thinking that while in Russia dissidents were mostly right-wing and getting increasingly reactionary in their ideology, at the same time in Eastern Europe the general trend of kind of dissident thought seemed to be more like democratic socialist, or well, maybe liberal socialist, but at least more to the left compared to what was typical for the Russian dissident movement. And as we were together with my friends and comrades of that time, left socialists and left-wing dissidents, we were like very rare birds and very isolated in the dissident milieu compared to the other currents. But we looked at Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe, for inspiration, thinking, okay, but there are people in Czechoslovakia, in Poland and Yugoslavia who were much closer to our ideas than those around us in Moscow. And then in the 1990s, something strange happened. Because quite a few of former Soviet dissidents who were right-wing liberals or just non-socialist Democrats, all of a sudden, watching what was going around, seeing what was becoming the new Russian capitalism, they started moving to the left. They started moving to some kind of left liberal positions, not necessarily socialist, but at least left liberal, and very often they started reconsidering their view of socialism and even their view of the Soviet period, because quite a lot of dissidents now, if you ask them, they're now more positive about what was happening in the Soviet Union than the former Communist Party bosses, who are now, of course, the new bourgeoisie and the ideologues of the new capitalist class. So this is a reversal of roles which happened in the former Soviet Union, at least in many cases. At the same time, however, a reversal was happening in Eastern Europe. Quite a lot of people who used to be Marxist dissidents or socialist dissidents or democratic socialists or left-wing social democrats, whatever, all of a sudden they became nationalists or right-wing liberals. They changed their views very dramatically, and that was quite a catastrophic moral experience for us. Because we used to, as I told you before, we used to look for inspiration at these people, at these currents. And now things are kind of back to normal in a way that capitalism is necessarily bringing about the development of a left-wing movement, the development of resistance, both social and intellectual. And in that sense, things are normalizing, and now we have new left-wing movements all across the former communist bloc. But then we are coming to the next stage when it's not just enough to be critical, it's not just enough to think critically about capitalism. It is important to remember the famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, written by Marx, and I have to remind those who probably forgot it or didn't read the 11th thesis that philosophers just interpreted the world, but the issue is how to change it. And so a big problem with academic left is that it completely dropped that 11th thesis. We are great at interpreting, we are great at criticizing, we really feel some kind of fun criticizing, mocking capitalism, analyzing capitalism, and we do not so really well in terms of changing the society, not even in reformist terms, because also very often radicalism and some kind of revolutionary discourse is becoming an alibi for those who don't want to change things in practice. Because of course practical change is always a partial change. Even if you are totally revolutionary, every practical change, every practical movement consists of partial steps. And every step is just a step. It doesn't change the whole world immediately. It just brings you one step forward, and you can go very fast. And the revolution, for example, is a period when you make a lot of steps and you make them fast, but still have to make concrete steps. And every step is limited. And in that sense, this kind of radical revolutionary discourse is very often becoming, as I already said, an alibi for those who are not going or doesn't want to think in terms of practical steps which can and should be made for social change right now, immediately in the current situation. And that could work well maybe 10, 15 years ago, when the situation was socially, politically, and economically more or less stable. So you were in a situation of being kind of limited by the stability of the system, being paralyzed by the stability of the system. Because you could say, okay, we know what's wrong about the system, but as long as the system works, as long as it brings about some kind of prosperity, at least for the majority of the middle class, we cannot launch some kind of full-scale offensive against the system, simply because the condition is not ready for that. So what we can do, we have to develop our discourse, we have to develop our analysis, we have to build up our organizations, we have to build up our intellectual capacity, but that's what we can do, and there is not much else we can do. However, for the last 5 or 7 years, the situation is getting different. the system is deeply in crisis. And more, it's not only a crisis of the system, it's a crisis that we predicted. It's a crisis that we analyzed in advance. By the way, it's very funny when I read, for example, about one or another liberal economist like Rubini, for example, who predicted the crisis. I mean, it's very funny. Rubini is a famous economist because he predicted the crisis. Wait a minute. What Rubini said is just 5% of what was written by left-wing critics of the system years before Rubini opened his mouth. And long before Rubini started speaking about the financial crisis, we had the works of Susan George, the works of Walden Bellow, later the works of Stiglitz, and so on and so on. So all that was predicted and analyzed. And in that sense, the crisis which happened in 2007 was of no surprise to us. More than that, it was exactly following this scenario which was developed in our discussions years before that, and it was mentioned that I ran a global crisis project at Transnational Institute. It was actually 2005, 2006, and it was just about designing the scenario for the coming crisis, and we had a very good team, and I'm proud to say the scenario was basically right, basically correct. So things started happening according to the scenario which we had. And it's not only us at the Transnational Institute, it was also done by quite a few other people. So in that sense, the crisis didn't come out as a surprise to us. And in more general terms, if we are looking at the left-wing or anti-globalization movements, it didn't come as a surprise to these movements. Because all these ideas, all these predictions and scenarios were shared widely in the movements, so they're well known. The whole concept of, for example, contradiction between the development of financial sector and the real economy, the disconnection between the financialized capitalist economy and the real needs, even including the market demand. It was already quite visible in the period of 2005, 2006. So it's very interesting, and a very interesting point, by the way, to understand the crisis, which is that the financialized capitalist elite is not only in contradiction with the objective social needs of society, as we can define them or as we can understand them. It's not only a contradiction between the way the financial economy is working and the society is working, but it's also a contradiction between the financialized economy and the market itself. Because even if you took the market demand of the mid-2000s, what was very interesting was that the financialized economy was strangling demand, was destroying, in many ways destroying demand side of the economy, so thus undermining the real sector, even in market terms. So even if you are not a socialist or a Marxist, even though you don't have this kind of analysis, you could understand that the money was taken away into the speculation bubbles from the real sector, and thus, of course, the demand was strangled, and thus, of course, the only way to support demand was to increase credit, and it was like a self-perpetuating crisis. It's not like a vicious circle which was emerging, because the more you depend on demand to keep the demand, the more you depend on the credit, the more you depend on the credit to keep the demand on the ground, the more you also contribute to the new bubbles, which actually strengthen the real sector and strengthening the demand, and thus undermining the economy. So in that sense, it's a vicious circle which we're still in. So when the crisis erupted, it was around 2007, 2008, very fashionable to speak in, so to say, Keynesian terms, to speak about regulation, to speak about the role of the state again, And all of a sudden, even the newspapers like the New York Times or Financial Times started speaking about some kind of socialist approach to the economy coming back. And that was a moment when almost everybody thought that neoliberal concept of free market, the neoliberal type of economy, or at least the neoliberal economic policies were dead. So that was the feeling, and nothing like that happened. On the contrary, what we saw in the next years, in the next 4 or 5 years, was some kind of reincarnation of neoliberalism, which kind of came back with vengeance, as the English say. So it did not only re-emerge, it also re-emerged in a more aggressive and destructive way. Not only it was austerity policy, which was introduced in most countries, by the way, including countries which did not have financial crisis of public budget, like Russia. But it was also coming back in a very aggressive ideological form, accompanied with the rise of the far right. So in that sense, the only new element to the picture is that the right is emerging out of this crisis at this stage, more aggressive, more offensive, and it is kind of coming back to the front in like two forms, in the form of aggressive neoliberal economic policies of the right-wing liberal governments, and in the form of the new right-wing populist movements. And to make things worse, in many cases it is exactly the populist far right which is emerging in the public opinion as a force critical towards the system, as a political alternative, and as a force which is kind of anti-systemic. Very often you see that social criticism is becoming very much the element of right-wing discourse. Of course, it's a purely demagogic way of criticizing society. It's not addressing the real contradictions. It's more some kind of social demagogy, social rhetoric. But this kind of social rhetoric is very often used by the right, and to make things worse, you discover that the left is very shy, very often, to speak about social struggles and social needs, while the left speaks in a very kind of liberal voice, in a very kind of weak voice, speaking about mostly about the human rights, speaking about the minorities, speaking about anything except things which are really important in terms of anti-crisis alternative. So what happened to the left, and why is the crisis developing in such a way that so far the left is not winning, it's rather losing ground? Not everywhere, not in every country. Of course, we can look at Greece, where cities, the left-wing coalition is gaining ground. We can look at Germany, where Die Linke, the left party, is at least stable, though again it is not really progressing, which is bad news, because given the current development of political and economic situation, you could expect a party like Die Linke in Germany to make much more progress than they actually did make in practice. But again, if you're looking at many other places, you discover the situation is not really good. So then we always in Russia use two questions. We always come to two questions. One question is who is to be blamed, and the second question is what is to be done. So these are two standard Russian questions which I'm going to pose to myself now. So starting with who is to be blamed, I think we have to blame ourselves. Let's start with self-criticism. Because, again, I told you before that we were quite aware of what was coming. But the whole mentality, the whole kind of intellectual force of the left was oriented towards analytical criticism. It was not oriented towards building up practical alternatives. It was oriented towards criticizing and analyzing the system critically. And we all know this famous story, this famous tale of a boy who ran around shouting, "Wolves, wolves, wolves, the wolves are coming." And of course in the tale, in the story, it ended badly. The wolves really did come and they ate the boy. In our case it was different in a way. First of all, the wolves were real, and they were always real. And once the wolves really came, in our case we were the boy. They didn't eat us. In fact, they did eat some of those who denied the existence of the wolves. At least they bite a few of them. So because, of course, quite a lot of neoliberal economists who insisted that there was no crisis coming, that everything was fine, that there were no wolves around, they suffered a terrible decline of their prestige and authority, at least academically, including some funny stories which keep going on now, like about the students who recalculated some of the models which were considered to be basic models for economic policy, and then some postgraduate students just recalculated these models and discovered that there were arithmetic mistakes in these models, and these mistakes were exactly the main evidence which was presented to justify the policy. So people simply didn't know how to count. So they did take a lot of blame for what happened. But okay, now we were addressed as specialists on wolves, because we kept speaking of wolves. The wolves came. Everybody knows we were speaking about that. So, all of a sudden, it came out that we were specialists in predicting the wolves coming, but no experts on how to fight the wolves. In fact, that's really strange, because actually, in the 1930s, we did have quite a few great names. And it's not only John Maynard Keynes who was no socialist, but these were economists like Karl Polanyi, for example, or Oskar Lange, and so on and so on. Michal Kalecki, by the way, quite a lot of them from Eastern Europe, who developed some kind of alternative policies, and many of these policies were actually if not put into practice, then at least they influenced the practical development in many countries after the Second World War, or even in the interwar period. So, in that sense, you cannot blame socialist thought for the lack of practical thinking historically. But in the period of 1990s, the moral and intellectual climate of the left was such that the left stopped thinking in terms of practical policies, in terms of proposals and strategies to be put into practice, and of course in terms of practical reforms. And instead, there was this kind of rhetoric of utopia. I remember it was the first European Social Forum when we had a discussion with one of the left-wing MPs from Sweden who insisted on the left having no practical policies, no policy proposals. Why? Because any policy proposal is authoritarian, is it excludes all other policy proposals, right? They say we need hundreds of alternatives. So if you are speaking about any kind of strategy, any kind of practical proposal, that means that you're excluding hundreds of other proposals, which is undemocratic. So you don't have to work out any policy proposal. That was the kind of approach. And I just remember there is a Spanish playwright, José Sánchez Sinisterra, and in one of his plays, a girl comes to an employer asking for a job, and he says, "Why do you need this job? If you get this job, that means that you'll just do this job. And there are millions of other jobs you can do. You can do this job or another job or another job, and as long as you're unemployed, you have all possible options, hundreds of options ahead of you. And once you get employed, you will just have one option, and you'll have to go along this way. So you better stay unemployed. That allows you to choose between alternatives." So, and that's exactly the irony which reflected that kind of approach. And we kept speaking about great utopias, hundreds of alternatives, and so on. So this kind of pluralist culture, which was developed quite reasonably as an answer to the experience of Stalinism, which was, of course, autocratic, which was really based on excluding not only other alternatives, but also other opinions. And in that sense, of course, it's quite understandable why the left went along that way. So it's understandable why the left rushed into another extreme. But understanding doesn't mean accepting. And in that sense, the first problem of the left was that the left stopped thinking in terms of radical policy proposals. The second problem is that the left stopped thinking in class terms. And I think now we can point to particular people to blame, and Hart and Negri are the ones to be blamed among others, probably more than others. Because with all their multitudes rhetoric, it was just about decomposing not only the kind of Marxist sociology or Weberian sociology which existed before, but it was about decomposing social thought as such. Because the only thing you know about the multitudes is that they are undefinable, which means that you have to stop thinking sociologically. And that also means that you have to stop acting on the basis of social thinking. And instead of building up class alliances, instead of working to consolidate the existing classes, we had all this rhetoric of thousand flowers and great multitudes and minorities. Because instead of working in favor of majority, as the left used to for more than a century, we picked up this cult of minorities, and of course it's interconnected with multiculturalism. And let us be very clear, of course we have to protect the oppressed minorities, as long as they are oppressed, by the way. There is nothing great about being a minority. Not every minority is oppressed. And also, not every oppression, and not every form of oppression necessarily has to deal with a minority. So the problem, however, is that the concept of defending the interests of oppressed minorities is put into the context of defending the majority which is oppressed, organizing along the lines of majority interests, and including the interests of oppressed minorities into the general strategy of defending the interests of the working majority. So it's not about forgetting about minorities. It's not about not supporting their rights. But it's about putting their rights into the context of majority interests. This is exactly the way forward. And this is what should differ the left-wing approach from a neoliberal or liberal multiculturalism, which is just about praising whatever minority you have, just because it is a minority. And in that sense, the important thing is to go back to class interests and class struggles, but of course classes today are not the ones which we used to have 100 years ago. Of course, the class structure of society did change. So in that sense, again, if you're just going along the lines of this kind of Stalinist or Trotskyist rhetoric, just repeating the slogans about class struggle, the working class and so on, it makes very little sense. It doesn't work. But this, again, very often is used as an alibi by those who don't want to work and think in class terms today. Because the very fact that the classes today are not the same as they used to be, say in 1900, doesn't mean that there are no classes now. It only means that you have to work with the current society, with its own class divisions and class structure. And we should not forget that classes are not just objective things. They develop through social struggles, and they develop through action. And for example, if we're speaking about the working class, what did make it one class? If you take England, say in 1830, England in 1840, there were miners, there were locomotive drivers, there were steel workers, there were people who worked as servants, and so on and so on. What did make them into one class? What did make them feel like one class? It was not only some kind of objective thing that sociologists like Karl Marx just wrote some texts explaining that these people form one class. But there were hundreds and thousands of activists, propagandists, political leaders, both workers and intellectuals, who did work every day to build up practical solidarities between these people. Not only to explain to them that they all formed one class objectively, but also they worked creating the practical networks of solidarity through action, day by day. And by the way, one big problem is that very often the left doesn't work on practical solidarity networks. We love to discuss books. We love to discuss ideas. We are great at that. We have great books to discuss. We have great ideas to discuss. We enjoy it. We're nice people. We love each other. We love to discuss things among ourselves. But there are millions of people outside these nice circles who simply don't read these books and don't know about them. And it's just not about making all these people read these books, but it's about working on practical solidarities, on practical alliances, on practical action, which would make quite a lot of people become interested in reading a lot of other books, including these books we read now. But that would be a practical necessity. Only as long as we do it as a practical thing, it goes. And then again, there is one more problem which is very interesting, and I would be very interested also to get your opinions on that, because I have some understanding of what's happening in Western Europe. I have I hope I have some understanding of what's happening in my own country, but for us now, it's very interesting, East Central Europe is becoming a mystery. So, at least for Russian leftists, it's much easier to have contacts, say in France, England, Germany, than in Prague, Belgrade, Sofia. We are now just beginning to rebuild these links, these networks. But what we are facing in Western Europe is a crisis of democratic institutions. And these institutions in many ways were hijacked by neoliberals, and they're emptied of substance. Like, you can have elections, but the elections will bring one or another neoliberal party into power. And in that sense, whether in France you elect socialists or you elect the right, liberal right, doesn't make a big difference. Or in Spain, doesn't make a big difference whether you elect a socialist party or a right-wing party, because they are all going to carry out the same policy. And it's a kind of mutual agreement within the political class, which turns these political classes against the society. It's a coalition of different political formations against the grassroots society, and in that sense, Western democracy is getting increasingly emptied of its traditional substance. It's getting increasingly more and more like what Antonio Gramsci used to call an empty shell. But at the same time, this democracy is a result of enormous struggles of the working class, by the way, and by the society in general. So you just cannot just throw it away. You just can't say, okay, it has no meaning, it doesn't have a value, just forget about it. So in that sense, institutions are not functioning the way they used to. They're not functioning according to their democratic meaning. They're emptied of their democratic substance, but they're still respected by the people, and they are still important. And in that sense, what we face in the West is that very often people come close to a full-scale rebellion against neoliberalism, but they just come close and they stop where the institutional structures begin. The institutions block struggles. You can go to demonstrate. You can have hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in the streets. You can have street fighting. You can have strikes. You can have marches. You can have blockades. But once it comes to the acceptance of an elected government, for example, you have to obey the rules. It is an elected government, okay. It's a democratic government, you have to respect it. By the way, there is a different model, like we can refer to what happened in Argentina in 2001, when the popular rebellion threw out an elected government. And the popular uprising just forced an elected parliament to resign, and they forced an elected president to resign. And that continued till finally the electoral system started getting closer to what people really wanted. So the street movement, the mass movement, actually did not stop at this threshold of institutional structures, but it smashed some of the institutions and transformed them in a way by force. But this is something which I don't see as possible in Western Europe so far, and ironically, this is exactly why the far right is gaining ground, because the far right is critical of democratic institutions. And at the moment when democratic institutions are becoming crisis-ridden and they're losing their authority, that attack on democratic institutions from the right is becoming kind of effective. But there is a problem, because we criticize these institutions because they lost their democratic meaning, while the far right is attacking these institutions from a different side. They're basically attacking them exactly because they still have some democratic meaning. Because they want to smash them, but they don't want to smash them not because they're undemocratic, rather because they want to install a totally undemocratic system in their place. And speaking about Russia, the situation is like a mirror image of what we have in the West. Because people don't have any respect towards institutions. They don't care about institutions. They don't respect any kind of elected government or parliament, among other things, because they're 100% certain that elections were fraud-ridden, that the elections were falsified. Ironically, it's very interesting, very often people are certain that elections were falsified even when they were not. It's another interesting case. I asked, we had a research that we have spoken to a few people who worked in Russia on electoral committees. And it's very interesting what they answered, because of course it was not in public, they didn't give their names and so on, but they said, yes, of course, they said, we did inflate figures. But we didn't inflate figures in favor of one single party. It was not just United Russia. No, because the main problem was that people simply didn't come to vote. Usually, no more than 20 or 30% of people who have the right to vote come. And we have to report that 60% came. What we have to do, we have to add more voters who, according to the lists, cast their votes. And I said, but how you add the results? Do you add or do you just add all these votes to the government party? They said, no, not at all. We are honest people. Our fraud is perfect, 100% honest. We just add every party according to its proportion. So that's not easy to fraud. Of course it is. But it actually reflects the disrespect towards institutions rather than people just moving one particular party into the winning position. So, as I say, Russians do not believe in these institutions, but on the other hand, Russians don't have this experience, this capacity of building up practical solidarity, because Western civil society is kind of exercising its mobilization capacity. The class organizations like trade unions, they mobilize, they organize on the daily basis, and even though they do not present an alternative in terms of how to do things differently compared to what is happening now, they are kind of reproducing their organizational capacity and their organizational solidarities day after day after day after day, and that's why we see all these movements and all these forces in the streets. While if you take Russia or Ukraine, by the way, it's the similar story, you can see that people are not really having any respect towards institutions. They don't have any limits which would prevent them to go beyond a certain point, but they don't have these organizational networks, this experience of practical solidarity day after day after day, and these structures of solidarity. So, in that sense, both to the east and to the west we have problems which prevent left-wing action being effective, and I would be very interested in your comments on what's happening here in former Yugoslavia, in Serbia, in Southern Europe and so on. But finally, after speaking about who is to be blamed, what is to be done. And I think, first of all, of course, we have to rebuild class organizations, but in a broad, modern sense, understanding that what we mean by working class is not just the industrial workers of the 20th century, it's a much broader concept, and we have to work on making these concepts practical. And of course, what we also need is some kind of Marxist-Keynesian radical New Deal economics. And again, the question is whether it's radical enough. Maybe it's not. I'm not sure that it's radical enough. The point is not whether it's radical enough or not. The point is that unless we make this first step, we will never go anywhere. And the first step is definitely to insist on mass public investment in healthcare, education, infrastructure, to insist on the development of the public sector, not only as a counter-crisis measure, but as a way to rebuild the society after the neoliberal disaster. So in that sense, we can look at what governments are doing now with all these austerity policies and say it's a very good manual of what is not to be done. Just do everything opposite. It's a very practical thing. You just examine what they're doing. Of course, they can also be mistaken. So you have to examine that critically. But the basic approach is just read what they did and do exactly the opposite on every single case, except some cases when they're probably mistaken, when by mistake they did the right thing. Could happen, but rarely. Because usually these are very competent people. They usually do the right thing in their terms, which is the wrong thing in our terms. And of course we have to speak about public property. The final thing is that nationalization should be brought back as a slogan, as a concept. And of course, again, here we face a trap. Because if we're speaking about nationalization, what we have in mind the Stalinist concept of centralized planning, state-controlled enterprises, and so on. Again, saying that is very often becoming an alibi not to think in terms of designing and inventing a new concept of a public enterprise, which is more democratic, which is more transparent, more open, and so on. And we absolutely have to go beyond the old Stalinist vision of public sector, or the old social democratic vision of public sector. But to go beyond that, we can progress only if we rehabilitate the very idea of nationalization of public property. So we have to get this idea back, but not to repeat the previous experience, but to go beyond the previous experience. And in that sense, again, we have to think of the so-called socialist experiences of the post-war period, not in terms of reproducing them, and not in terms of being nostalgic, but in terms of examining them critically, not to repeat the mistakes which were made, but also to find some positive experience as well, because it was there, because there were revolutionary experiences, and there were revolutionary breakthroughs. And in that sense, we have to be both critical in terms of our past, but also apologetic sometimes. We don't have to be afraid to say that certain things were good, and certain things were correct, and certain things have to be protected, defended, and reproduced or returned. That doesn't mean that we have to be Stalinists or whatever. We just have to be critical, but in that sense, being critical is also to be critical about ourselves, and we have to reconsider even our own criticisms of the former Soviet system, because we were sometimes right, but sometimes wrong. And given all that, I think that we still have a perspective. Why do we have a chance? Because the crisis is not disappearing. Because the reproduction of neoliberal policies, all these austerity measures, will only lead to the continuation of the crisis. They will extend the crisis. They stabilize the crisis, as a friend of mine and a colleague of mine, Vasily Koltashov, Russian economist, said. They stabilized the crisis. They didn't overcome the crisis. They stabilized the crisis. But stabilizing the crisis means reproducing the crisis. Means that the crisis is going to continue. And that means that we have time. We have time to build up new organizations and movements. We have time to work on more practical alternatives and policies. We have time to build up organizations. Not unlimited time. And as I told you before, we have a very strong competitor, which is the far right. And it's getting stronger by the day. But we still have time, and we still have a chance to build up the networks of practical solidarity and the organizational forces of social change. And if we work hard, we have a chance of winning. Thank you.